Okay, hey everyone. This is Urbano. I wanted to go over military organization just a bit with you guys because I know it can be like super confusing, and I feel like they didn't like quite put together everything as concisely as I would have liked. But just like starting from the top, we start with like POTUS, President of the United States. He puts together the national security strategy. This is basically like desired end states, and it's not military specific. It's just like whole of government. Then obviously we go down to like SecDef, Secretary of Defense, who does your national defense strategy and runs the Department of Defense. The national defense strategy is going to be how we're pursuing the POTUS's like desired end states. So it's going to be all about what we're doing to either counter threats or get after the issues that he's presented. And then kind of the main divide that I'm going to be going out throughout this whole thing is the divide between organizing, training, and equipping, and like the war fighting. War fighting is going to be represented by purple because purple is joint, and OT&E is green because that was the other pin I had on hand. um, so the next step down from like both of those is on the OT&E side. There's going to be your chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who's of course responsible for putting together the national military strategy. The national military strategy is about the means in which we're going to accomplish the ways that the NDS put out to get to the end states that the NSS put out. So basically, this does make sense because the POTUS is the one who does like the overall strategy, like this is where we want our country to go. The SecDef is like, okay, like how does the military play into that? And then the people who are organizing, training, and equipping are actually talking about like the resources and the allocation and the people needed to do those things. So it does make sense. I promise. It's just complicated. And then there's the warfighting side. So we have our unified combatant commands. Of course, we learned that there's 11, 7 with AORs, 4 without AORs. These are all designated by the unified command plan. And all combatant commanders at that level have COCOM, which is their authority. And if you couldn't guess, it can't be delegated. They only foot stomped that like 60 times. So this is where things get like a little bit spookier, but I'm going to try to like break it down like a little bit. So these are just your joint chiefs that fall under the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So you have your like chief of staff of the Army, chief naval officer, chief of staff of the Air Force, whatever. And then we come over here and we look at the service components and the functional components. You'll notice the service components are green, and that's because they represent the OT&E aspects of your CCMDs versus your functional components, which represent your joint warfighting aspects. So like moving this, again, on your OT&E side, this is all supposed to be A staff because I put it under the Chief of Staff of the Air Force. So my bad, just imagine those are all A's. Doesn't really matter. I was just trying to like point out where those kind of fit into the whole thing. But then over here is your service components and your functional components, like I just talked about. So your service components are going to be, I use Southcom as an example because I work there, so it's just like what I'm familiar with. It's going to be like R South, Nav South, AF South, whatever others. I just stuck with those for right now. And you're going to have your commanders of those forces in the region. So for AF South, you had your COMSPACEFOR. And so that's the commander of all the Air Force, like U.S. Air Force people in Southcom. Now, on the other side, with your functional components, you have your joint functional land component, joint functional maritime component, air component. We almost always just refer to these as JFLIX, JFMIX, JFACs. So which is technically what you call the commander, but I honestly had never heard of like the fully spelled out version until I got to this class. So like in my case, my COMSPACEFOR, so Commander of Air Forces, the service component, OT&E side, and my JFAC, the functional component, warfighting side, were the same person, dual-hatted. And I think in most cases they are, and that's what the little like black dashes indicate in between. So you're just looking at the AF South, again, that's my cat. So like just looking at the Air Force's side, the COMSPACEFOR is responsible for the OT&E of all Air Force assets in support of that combatant command. So essentially, they're going to be responsible for all of the Air Force kids and all of the Air Force assets that are in Southcom. They handle the organizing, training, and equipping aspect of that, and that is specifically OPCON. So service components have OPCON. Now, on the other side, with the functional components, your JFAC is responsible for all of the branch's air operations in the combatant command. So it doesn't matter if it's an Air Force, Navy, or Army plane, the JFAC is the one that is in charge of its operational status, and that is TACON. So in general, your OpCon is only going to be like from one branch to the same branch. It's like inside that one branch versus like your TACON, which is often one branch has like some amount of authority over the other ones. So I chose Southcom because I was familiar with it, but then I realized afterwards that there's no real like space component in Southcom. I'm sorry, my cat is of course being a pain in the ass. But like other CCMDs would have a terrestrial COMSPACEFOR in the service component. And then they would have a GIFSIC in their functional component. So basically your COMSPACEFORs, which we talked about at length in class, are available in any combatant command that has it in their service component. And then your GIFSIC is going to be available in any of your functional component in any combatant command. Now, if you add another nation into this mix, all of these J's on this side turn into C's. All of that's going to be combined. So like, again, my commander was both the COMAFOR, the JFAC, and the CFAC because we were working with like Colombians and the Chileans. And so since we had other countries there, it was combined as well as joint and like as well as his other hat. So he had like 3 hats. Compared to the S4S we're going to talk about later, that seems like nothing. The last piece of this puzzle is going to be your sub-unified commands and your joint task force. So let's say the POTUS decides that he wants to invade Panama to like get the Panama Canal, not related to current events. He might set up a sub-unified command to focus on Panama. This sub-unified command is going to fall under the Unified Combatant Command, but it's going to have the exact same structure as this. It's going to have a service component piece and a functional component piece. They're just going to have a smaller scope than all of Southcom. They would just be focusing on Panama. But that would be like a standing requirement. It was something that would exist for a really long time. And our like the Southcom combatant commander would likely have to go over here and ask these guys for stuff and people. So like, and then the other thing is joint task force, right? So let's say that there's an earthquake in Haiti, which happens like every 2 years. You could stand up a task force, right, to handle that and do like crisis response, humanitarian aid, disaster relief. This example here isn't exactly right, but like JTF Bravo is like a counter drug joint task force, and it's a standing task force. And you could have another task force under that. So JIADF South is the joint integrated air task force South. So it could just be like it's effectively the air component of this, but that's horrifically confusing. It's just like a subset of this of Joint Task Force Bravo. And this could technically go on till infinity, right? You could have sub-unified commands with JTFs, you could have JTFs with other JTFs, but they all fall under like the combatant command as a whole. Last thing I want to say on this is the AdCon piece. Your AdCon is always going to be on the branch side, on the service side, because at the end of the day, even if me, baby senior airman Urbano, goes to work with AF South and I'm reporting to the COMAFOR, who's also the JFAC, and we're going up through this chain, he still owns me. He controls my promotions. He controls like my pay. So at the end of the day, he has like, and by he, I mean like the Air Force has like administrative control over me. So yeah, that's just like where this last piece comes in. So you can kind of think of it as like the service that owns you has AdCon over you, the service component that owns you has OpCon over you, and then whoever the joint or like the functional component is has TACON over you. Moving on to how this applies to like Space Force and the Space Command. So again, Space Force is like pretty simple. We're known to have like the flattest structure. So like we have our S staff over here. That's all your like S1, S2, whatever. And then we have field commands, deltas, and squadrons, right? That's that. That is supposed to be force presentation for this piece, as well as like other combatant commands, but primarily Space Command. So with Space Command, you get your commander of U.S. Spacecom. Again, they have COCOM authority. Again, we choose these commanders based off of preponderance of forces and ability to like operate this.
So like preponderance of forces just means whoever has the most, right? If Army has 5 satellites, Navy has 6, Air Force has 2, but like Space Force has 10. Space Force has like the preponderance of forces and therefore gets to be the commander of this. We have the most amount of assets, therefore we have the most amount of like buy-in to this. We're the ones that get to like control everything else. So the service components look almost exactly the same as like your standard combatant command. You have your Army, your Marines, your Navies, your Air Force. Shout out to Air Force for being the only one that followed like the standard nomenclature. And then your S4S, which I'll talk about a little bit more. But like the service components, again, are responsible for presenting forces and assets to the combatant command. And again, that's OPCON. It's your operational control because they're effectively doing like the operational prep to enable what's happening on this side. What's happening on this side are your functional components, and in the Space Command, it does look a little weird. There's only two. The only one that's relevant to understand right now is the Combined Joint Force Space Component Commander. I don't know if it's usually just Component Command. Who knows? But in the slides, it was Space Component Commander. This person is responsible for all branches ops in space, just like the functional component commander of like the last example. So like again, they have take on over any of these guys. So like let's say like Army provides like an RSST and like Marines provide an MSST, and then Navies provide whatever the Navy provides, boats, I guess. Then like we would have take on over this, and by we I mean this guy. Space Force has take on over all of their assets that they're providing to this combatant command. So they're the ones that's actually like putting them into operational use and like doing the mission planning and stuff like that. The reason why this gets a little bit weird is because like, first off, like I said, there's only two versus like there's usually an equal amount of service and like functional because it's based off of like domain. But in this one, there's only the two. You only have to care about this one. Don't worry about the other one. And then there's like, these fall directly under the COMSPACEFOR, which again is this guy. There are 3 other ones. Again, I don't think we need to care about those, but CSPOC looks like below the 100-kilometer like AOR, and like the National Space Defense Center looks above the 100-kilometer like AOR. So basically these guys are actually operating in the Spacecom AOR, and these guys are not operating in the Spacecom AOR. They're focused on terrestrial things. They're focused on like orbital things. So before we get into the Joint Task Force, I want to go back to like the S4S. So again, the S4S is both a person and an organization. So the person who in any other combatant command would be referred to as the COMSPACEFOR. In Space Command is referred to as the S4S because this is Space Forces for Space, which is the service component. So again, S4S is both the service component and the commander of the service component. This person is the same as COMSPACEFOR. So this person has OPCON over Space Force, all Space Force assets in Spacecom, and they also have take on over everybody's assets in Spacecom. This person is incredibly busy. And then the other piece for COMSPACEFOR is they're responsible to the Chief of Space Operations over here for OTE and ADCON, because again, your branch is still going to have administrative control over like all the people that are over here. So think of it this way, we're in STARCOM right now. This is all training, right? So that's the organizing, train, and equip part. We'll go to the deltas, we'll get some experience, and then once we're like good enough to go, we'll get sent over to S4S and we'll like support over here. Spock does its own thing too, but that's a conversation for another day. But so yeah, so the COMSPACEFOR has kind of 3, there are responsibilities in like the Quizlet and like on the slide, so I don't want to like confuse against those, but just like the kind of simplest way for me to put it is they have OPCON and ADCON and TACON responsibilities, in the sense that they have OPCON because they're the service component commander. They have TACON because they're the functional component commander, and because they're the service component commander, they also have ADCON responsibilities to him. So again, this person, like COMSPACEFOR, COMSPACEFOR, who's the same person, dual-hatted, again, that's what like the dotted line represents, very busy person. If they decide that they're not quite busy enough, though, they can decide to stand up a JTF, which they would also be the commander of. Again, a JTF would fall into the same thing. It would have a service component side and a functional component side, but this would all be the same person. So yeah, I strongly recommend like looking over like the S4S COMSPACEFOR aspect. But if you start looking at it too hard, it does kind of all start to like blur together. There's a lot of words in there, like like there was like a field command component commander, which was freaking me out for like 5 minutes. But at the end of the day, hopefully this was like a decently helpful breakdown. The only other thing I can think of is like an example, which would be like, let's say like I'm at the 74th TIS, which is an Intel squadron under Delta 3, which is Spock. And I get sent over to like S4S. My boss, like my administrative control would still be over in the Space Force, would still fall under that squadron, whoever my supervisor was in my squadron. But then my like operational control would be in the hands of the S4S. And like they would be the ones that would basically make sure that I was like equipped in the combatant command and was like in place for like whatever they needed. And then the Sejifsik would be the one who was actually like giving my like day-to-day orders, like go target this satellite or go look at this picture or like whatever, right? So like that's kind of the easiest way for me to like explain this. I know it's complicated. I'm sorry. I hope this helps. If you have questions, like please feel free to reach out to me. I had this stuff beat into my head by like a 30-year army jag, so hopefully I can answer your questions. Bye.